Thank you, Dr. Livero and Dr. Glasspool, and thank you, IGCS and the Planning Committee for the invitation and opportunity to serve on this panel. My name is EIlis, and I'm a survivor of recurrent ovarian cancer and early-stage breast cancer from the United States. I serve as the GYN cancer community as a research advocate, and I provide peer support. I am so deeply honored to be here today alongside two incredible panelists, Adrienne Moore, a certified respiratory therapist and a board member of ECANA, the Endometrial Cancer Action Network for African Americans, and a patient advocate from the United States, and Dr. Leslie Randall, a gynecologic oncologist from the United States. To begin this session, I've been asked to share my experience with clinical trials. I have nothing to disclose. So just a little bit about the twists and turns of my journey with ovarian cancer. The first 4 years were pretty rough with 2 recurrences, first on and then in the liver. I had 3 debulking surgeries. The last was a partial liver resection and 5 different chemotherapy regimens. But what I'm here to talk about is how I got interested in clinical trials. And the first time I got interested was in support group as I was nearing the end of first-line treatment. A fellow support group member had brought in the clinical trial that she was being offered, and she goes, "Oh, Annie, look what they want me to do. It just sounds so Frankenstein." And as I'm flipping through the pages and pages of papers that were faxed to her, this was back in 2004, the olden days, I was looking through and I was like, this sounds pretty interesting. They're going to teach my body how to find the cancer. I want a piece of this. And so I went on a second opinion, and I did not qualify for this particular clinical trial, but I was able to at least, get some more information. And when I went back to my original oncologist and said, "Hey, I saw this other guy about this thing," and he said to me, "If I knew you were interested in clinical trials, that's who I would have sent you to." But the thing is, I didn't know I was interested in clinical trials until I saw a clinical trial that I was interested in. So that was my first experience. Then I went to a Survivor conference when I was early in second remission. And there a medical oncologist told the ladies, she said, "Ladies, you need to think about going into clinical trials sooner rather than later in your journey. And with ovarian cancer, we have a high rate of recurrence. And the more treatment that you've had, the fewer trials that you qualify for, and you can use clinical trials to expand your treatment options. If the trial drug doesn't work, what we have already approved in the medical, in standard of care is still there for you." So that was a really intriguing thing and something that I looked for. I didn't qualify at decision points because I didn't have visible disease after my surgeries. And next, when I got into my third remission, I was able to participate in a clinical trial. I had switched hospitals, and my PI, the principal investigator of the clinical trial, was my medical oncologist. And there were 3 different trials that were coming up through the pipeline in various stages of approval. And I had my eye on one that had different proteins that they were using, but the one that became available first was the one I went into because it was available. And I did not make those antibodies, but for some reason this remission number 3 is over 14 years. It'll be 15 years in December. With a second cancer, I got breast cancer 2 years into this remission, and by now I'm an expert. And I walked into that appointment with a stack of clinical trials that I found on the institution's website. And although I didn't qualify or none of the treatment trials worked, I did go into an imaging study to get me an MRI that my surgeon didn't want. I really wanted to know I wanted an MRI to have additional assurances, and I didn't want to fight the surgeon who was going to have a knife later and do my surgery. So this was a way to get access to something I really wanted and also contribute to the future. Now, I will say that when I walked in the door for my vaccine clinical trial, the first thing I saw was Experimental Treatment Center on the door, and it reminded me, this is an experiment. They don't know if it's going to work or not, but there's the preliminary science is promising, and it looks like it could, it might work, so this is why they need to try it. Once I walked in those doors, the care that I received from the team was just amazing. I was well taken care of, and I felt if anything happened, they were just going to be there and take care of me. At the time, I worked about 5 or 6 blocks away from where I was from the clinic, And it took about 6 hours, anywhere from 4 to 6 hours for them to defrost my vaccine, put it in a centrifuge, and get it ready for me. And I said, look, I'm a working girl. I don't want to use up all my sick time here. Could you please, is there anything we can do? And so they allowed me to leave, access, to go to work, and they called me. As soon as my vaccine was ready, I would run out the door, and I would be there, within 15 minutes if the elevators cooperated. And I do want to point out that my experience comes with many privileges. Just from being in this zip code in New York, I had my choice of cancer centers to go to. I could go and have a second opinion anywhere. If I wanted to get on a train or in a car, I have access to that. My insurance was really good. I needed a second scan before my trial because my previous scan was 1 week too old. Insurance covered it, no questions asked. My medical oncologist was the PI, and the study team worked with me, but the most important ingredient, I think, was communication. So this long-term survival has let me be my most important role, which is Grammy, to these 3 guys, and also to be involved in peer support and research advocacy. So I want to talk just very briefly about the clinical trial. The myths that we hear is that it's a last resort, I don't want to be a lab rat or a guinea pig, and I don't want a placebo. And once we have education and we talk with people, I give peer support. It takes me about 3 phone calls to get from someone who I never ever want to do a clinical trial to, I'll consider a clinical trial. I don't believe that every trial is right for everybody, but I think that everybody should be offered a clinical trial if there's one available. I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers. The first thing that we always hear about is trust. But what I'm hearing when I'm on peer calls is there's just not one available now, either where I live or for my type of cancer or my subtype, or I don't have, they just can't get to a clinical trial. Next is, do you qualify? Is there enough visible disease, or is it for your staging cancer? Is it first line or second line? Have you had too much treatment? And then we hear about, well, my doctor never told me. And so what I hear, these are, sorry, my animation got all messed up. So I'm just to put language to this, these are structural barriers, clinical barriers, and physician barriers. And I think this patient barriers, from the peer support perspective, it's all about the unknown. Is it going to work? We don't even know sometimes if the standard of care is going to work. Am I going to get a placebo, and what are the side effects going to be? But when I think of financial barriers, our financial hardships are often described. But let me tell you, getting cancer is expensive. And what hasn't been clearly identified in the literature is how much more expensive it is to be in a clinical trial. I want to share with you some work that Dicey and I did. In 2019, she spoke at the 50th anniversary of SGO, and she refuted, it's the patient, there's this mistrust, and that's why people don't, participate in clinical trials. And so we sat together for a little bit, and we thought, well, how can we quantify why people, do this or don't do this, and is trust really a part of it? And so we had this, we put out a survey and tried to get all GYN cancers. We actually, I believe, were international, but we worked really hard to get good representation here. And what we found, that people who didn't participate, it's because they didn't ask, or nobody talked to them about that. And I want to point out that the second reason for non-participation was other, and about half of those were because the treatment worked, or I'm NED, and we don't need this. Only one person said trust in the medical system, and that person identified as Caucasian. When we looked at the people who did participate, and it was about 2/3 to 1/3, almost all of them, 86%, said, I did it because my doctor. So this tells me that people trust their doctors. And 100% of these people, and this is the one thing that Dicey and I just really were amazed by, is that we asked them, would you do this again? And people either said yes or unsure. Nobody said no. Even if they didn't get the result that they didn't want, I think that these participants were open to doing it again. And so this kind of falls in line with the Unger systemic review about why, when offered to participate, just you got to ask them. And this is what Dicey said in 2019. Clinical trials are like a party that one needs an invitation to attend. You can't go to the party if you don't get an invitation. And just to give more language and structure to the barriers, as you can see here, again, more Unger work here, that the structural and clinical barriers have a greater impact than even the physician and patient barriers. And so when we're thinking about barriers, really try to think about what type of barrier it is. And, this is the side where I think our resources need to go to. We're always talking about fixing the patients, but we need to fix the systems. As far as broadening eligibility criteria, there's been a lot of work from ASCO and friends. But my personal pet peeve is outdated templates and investigator opinion. If you're an advocate and you're on the review and you see investigator opinion, please say something. I think this unintentionally can introduce opportunities for selection bias and implicit bias. And then from the research advocate perspective, who's missing from our teams? Who hasn't benefited from recent progress? And who do you have on your teams, that are patient advocates on your team? And these are ways we can help with the implicit bias training on design and consent forms and education materials. I just want to point out really quick, Rising Tide Foundation for Clinical Cancer Research has a very narrow scope, but they have a pre-application grant where if you fall into this, they will pay for a patient advocate to help with the grant writing and the questions, and so that when you apply, you can also include, supporting the patient's time and travel. So my final thoughts are, for a lot of people, clinical trials are hope, and how do we make it easier for people to participate? Thank you so much.